Hi, I'm Cara McGlynn, Lead School Social Worker with Northeast Metro 916. If you've been following these presentations for the past few weeks, you will know how long the pandemic's gone on because my hair has grown considerably, noticing that in the Google Meet window. Anyway, I hope you're all doing well and navigating through. This is the last of the presentations that I will be providing during our distance learning professional development. So I thought it would be the best use of time to talk about secondary traumatic stress and trauma. Again, for those that have been following for a few weeks, I clearly have a thematic structure I'm working under: trauma. Sorry, I think I'm really funny. Anywho, I think this is a really important time to talk about staff experiences. Given the pandemic, we've all lost our sense of agency. We're dealing with navigating disinformation and ever-changing information. People report to feeling flattened, feeling like they're functioning differently. We certainly have an inability to think ahead or plan, and fortunately, during typical practice in education, we're planners. Oh my goodness, our education faculty planners. They like to have their lists and their visuals and their schedules and their to-dos. The problem is right now, we don't know, and that uncertainty brings about kind of a low-level sense of anxiety consistently. So if you are feeling like you have some paralysis right now, emotionally and socially, know that that's really normal. So with that, I'll go ahead and get underway. Going along with what I said just a few moments ago about how I think I'm funny, I think this is a really great cartoon to demonstrate why it's super important that in addition to navigating and supporting student mental health and trauma, that we as staff ensure that we're taking care of our own. So I've got stressed out Eric and burned out Eric. It's really important just to note that stress is good for the most part. Stress, when it is tolerable and manageable, and we can, from that stress, have movement and develop mastery, that's really healthy. The problem is the stress that most of us are facing right now is, again, there's no movement. We're feeling stuck. There's that sense of paralysis. There's no mastery because we don't have any objectivity in how to navigate this situation. So if anything, we're all, as people, really navigating in more of a high-level stress that's unhealthy, maybe even moving into that burnt-out place. And that may or may not have to do with work. A lot of times this time of year when I'm working with educators, we're dealing with the burned out feeling because we've been in high intensity special education settings for the past 9 months, and we're just trying to get through. And we know that for our learners, they feel really dysregulated this time of year because school's ending, and what does that mean? And they're grieving. And that's just typically. So now we have all of that plus pandemic. So congratulations if you are taking really good care of yourself and you're not feeling this way. I do hope that there is a subset of the population that is feeling like they're navigating decently enough. And if you did watch the talk that Kevin Horst and I gave a few sessions ago, he really nicely outlined that most people are not okay right now, and that's okay. So I just want you to be really reflective and thoughtful about how you're functioning, because as we start to talk about traumatic stress and how it impacts your brain and body as staff, it's really important that we navigate in this place where we're really reflective in our practice so we know how we're being impacted. As the adults, we're asked to be bigger, kinder, and wiser. And if we don't have that objectivity in our own practice and around our own skills, it's impossible for us to maintain that in order to serve our students. So some learning objectives today: develop an understanding of burnout, vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, compassion fatigue. Transparently, I won't spend as much time on compassion satisfaction or compassion fatigue, but I will highlight that if that's a newer concept for you. Identify risks and protective factors. And then we'll talk about some tools for assessing, preventing, and responding to traumatic stress if you're experiencing it. Again, one tool that I just mentioned is just practicing reflection. And we'll get more into what that can look like. But I do know practitioners that journal, that spend time right after work driving around or playing a sport, but not going straight home, because it gives them the opportunity to decompress and process kind of what they've been through that day. So I am going to just be silent for a moment, and I want you to read through these statements. So if you're being really honest with yourself, you would likely be able to identify you have felt this way at one time or another during your time in education. Almost everyone has, and right? So almost everyone has felt this way, and it's really important that we identify what was happening when we were feeling this way, so that either we can be proactive, and as we're situating towards next year, we can ensure that we have some strategies so we don't get here. Or we also need to be thinking about how we can connect with people if we're in it still. So again, if you are feeling this way, there's no shame or blame around that. I think everyone in education at some point in time in their career will feel one, if not a few of these. And hopefully we'll give you some strategies to navigate if you're sitting with that. Again, I'm not going to read you the statistics, but I do think a couple are interesting as we were putting this together to highlight that 63% of police officers have moderate to severe impacts of secondary traumatic stress. 33% of Minnesota teachers were polled in 2016, and they wish they had never entered the profession. Never entered the profession. It's pretty heavy. And then the last bullet point, 74% of lawyers show functional impairment from secondary traumatic stress. Typically, here's where I like to make an inappropriate joke about who knew lawyers could feel things. I'll keep to my day job. I'm sorry. Okay, so what is it? Burnout. Burnout is basically gradual. And I think of, I'm very visual. So burnout for me, when I picture it, it's slow burn. It's that long line to the explosion, right? So if you think about, I don't know if anyone here is old enough to have watched Looney Tunes, but Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner are arch nemesis. And Wile E. Coyote would always try to crush the Roadrunner or blow him up in some way. These are older cartoons. They are not super politically correct. However, Wile E. Coyote would always leave a huge fuse before the dynamite would blow up, which for a Roadrunner was good because somebody could interrupt that fuse. That's what I think about burnout. It's that long fuse that, if it's not interrupted, eventually explodes into something like secondary traumatic stress. And now you can say you've been to a training in which Looney Tunes was cited as a mental visual. The last piece is just around how burnout is often associated in the workplace, where often the predictable outcome is that there are a lot of demands from the workers. And gosh, when you think about schools, what school staff are expected to do, I definitely think we can all agree that there are a great deal of demands on our faculty at schools. So we certainly are all working in an environment that is ripe for burnout if we don't think about our protective factors. So vicarious trauma, you might have heard about this if you're not familiar with this term, but framed as empathy fatigue or compassion fatigue. Basically, when we are in roles in jobs that put us as caregivers, there's this process of change that occurs because we are so committed and dedicated and caring about the people we're responsible for. And those people have in some way been hurt. So then we feel responsible to them for that hurt. And eventually, if we do not get that witnessing of their pain and trauma and fear and terror out of our own system, it creates some permanent change. And when we think again about what students bring to school, the school environment is ripe for this, and it can be interrupted. School staff deal with primary trauma, and that happens when you experience a actual physical trauma yourself, which can lead you to develop your own trauma symptoms, reactions, and triggers, or may re-trigger if you have a past trauma history, even if it is in remission. A primary trauma that happens at work can re-trigger your past experience of trauma. Okay, secondary traumatic stress. Now, I get people who, when I do this presentation, get a little bit tied up on the semantics of vicarious trauma versus secondary traumatic stress. I think for our purposes, it's the thing that's most important is vicarious trauma develops over time, whereas secondary trauma can happen really in the moment, once you're exposed to the trauma of another. This is oftentimes like what happens to a first responder. And again, in school settings, if we are dealing with crisis, that certainly can be our reaction as well. And that means that we ourselves are not going through the trauma, but we're exposed to the trauma of others. And we internalize it in a way that shows symptoms associated with things like post-traumatic stress disorder. So vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress do have some commonalities. And I think for our purposes, they're one and the same, right? As far as the way it's going to impact your life and your family and your friends and your functioning and your mental and physical well-being, they're the same. I do want to get into the nuance just because sometimes people are curious about it. But if you're one of those people that's just like, Cara, just give me what I need to know, just think of them pretty much the same way. Because at the end of the day, regardless of if you have vicarious trauma or secondary traumatic stress, if you experience that and your response is trauma, you are going to have some symptoms that look similar to PTSD. Most commonly, people have intrusive thoughts. And those are those thoughts that come into play when you're not expecting it, when you're not thinking about an incident. All of a sudden, they pop into your head. They're aroused typically by our senses. You'll also have some emotional indicators. You might feel indecisive, unable to relax, easily irritable. Behavioral indicators, maybe you're working harder to get less done. Perhaps you are engaging in some excessive smoking or gambling. You might have some physical indicators, frequent headaches, stomach aches, other pains, sleep changes. And again, because of COVID, you might be thinking, well, gosh, I have all of these categories in some way that are being impacted. And if that is the case, that is just an invitation for you to consider either looking into some additional support for yourself that you can manage on your own, or if things feel too big, looking into some support outside of yourself, and then thinking about what your employee assistance program has to offer, if you have any debriefers at your sites, and potentially what therapeutic services are being offered through your insurance, because telehealth is up and running well for therapy. So, as I was saying earlier, we work in an environment that is ripe for vicarious and secondary traumatic stress. And the research says that everyone who works with individuals with a history of trauma is vulnerable to developing secondary traumatic stress. So 90% of students in special education setting 4 indicate that they have some history of trauma. Yeah, and that's 90. And if we think about a lot of the practitioners that are viewing this are working in special education settings, the likelihood that between a student being enrolled in SPED and ending up in setting 4, there might just be a little bit more frequency of what's happening, I think it would be intelligent for us to assume that given that statistic of 90% in setting 4, that as we look at setting 2 and setting 3 and even setting 1 special education students, it is likely that they have also experienced a significant amount of trauma. So what puts you as a school staff at risk for secondary traumatic or vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma? Your age. We work in a field where a lot of amazing teachers and education assistants come to us very young. Unfortunately, that can be a risk factor. Life experience that is not always, but sometimes associated with age, does serve to be a protective factor. And typically that comes with as we get older. Talked about this a little bit before, but if you have a personal history of abuse or trauma, and this is regardless, it should always be a red flag for you as a provider and teacher. If you have a student who has a history that's really similar to yours, find somebody to consult with that you can share those parallels with, because there is a likelihood that not only will their situation, if it's still ongoing, be traumatic to you, there's also a likelihood that you're more likely to engage in unethical behavior and inequitable behavior, because they will be your favorite or you will hate them. Because they mirror an earlier experience of yourself, there's a lot of really negative impacts that will have on you, and potentially will enact them on the learner. Even if it feels like, oh, but I'm giving them everything I never had. Those thoughts are not good for you or the kid. So again, if you have a kid like that in your experience, make sure you're getting really good consultation. And if you can, reach out to a school social worker or a school psych at your building or site, school counselor. Any of those people would be really helpful as you're kind of processing if you're struggling with a student like that, or if you have potential to maybe cross some boundaries. Gender. So research says that women are more likely to develop vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress. A level of experience, we know the old timers in the teaching field have developed some patterns to support themselves. If you're newer, you might not have those experiences yet, and you might not have developed those protective factors. If you're dealing with a situation that conflicts with your ethics and values, again, that really puts you in a place for your boundaries to break down. You connect to the situation, and again, that brings about that secondary traumatic and vicarious trauma. Secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma. Sorry, tongue-tied today. If you're working in an environment where you're never allowed, right, quote unquote, but where the culture is that you can't have negative emotions, that's a risk factor. It's really important that we have open cultures in our schools so that people can have conversations and share negative and positive emotions. And then your level of preparation, and that goes back to that life experience, but also your preparation even in your classroom. If your classroom is not a well-oiled machine, and I think about our kindergarten staff here and our early ed staff, elementary classrooms are well-oiled machines. My goodness, like the visuals, the structure, the consistency, it is all set up. That is a protective factor, but again, if you don't have that sort of setup, that can be a risk factor. And again, I've already started touching on what those protective factors are. Some pieces that don't flip conversely into a risk factor to highlight. Person's own spirituality, regardless of what that is and what people believe in, being able to lean into some sort of faith-based belief is really supportive to people's development and resilience. Creativity is huge. I would encourage you to pick up a hobby. It's a good way to decompress and disconnect. Just knowing about secondary traumatic stress can be helpful. And what research tells us there is that knowledge is power, right? So if we're on the lookout and we're aware of it, we're less likely to really fall into those patterns or have those experiences that stick with us in that traumatic way. Compassion satisfaction. So before I was talking about compassion fatigue, and that's just that constantly giving of yourself, never feeling like you're getting back. On the flip side, if you're really satisfied at your job because you feel like your work is meaningful and it builds you up and you leave with a sense of purpose and you wake up every morning excited to see kids, that is a protective factor, hugely. And then preparation, which we talked about a little bit already. Again, man, those elementary classrooms. Other things that are protective factors. So just having your own set of boundaries and moral compass and standards and boundaries, and I'm going to say it again, and boundaries with students in work. If you all have an iPhone right now or some sort of smartphone and you have your work email connected here, if it does not turn off outside of your contact time or the app is constantly pinging at you over the weekend, I encourage you to take it off of your phone. You need to have a really clear boundary, especially as we're all working from home, between work time and home time. And if you're struggling to navigate that, you should feel empowered to talk to the support people around you, which goes into that self-awareness and that use of a self-care plan. Your peers are critical in encouraging you to support yourself, and they're also uniquely positioned to be objective if they're starting to see some of those problematic behaviors. So on some of the teams I'm on, we have clearly identified self-care plans that have some objective things to determine, like, what are those behaviors look like when I'm feeling burnt out? What might I physically look like? One of my teammates has on her self-care plan, if she comes into work 3 days in a row with a bun on her head, she's probably not functioning super well. When you develop something like that, it is important to get feedback from people who know you really well, but aren't necessarily you, because again, that objectivity, but then also sharing with them what you need. Some people, when they are struggling, they want to be touched. They want to talk about it and deeply process it. I am not one of those people. If you touch me when I am already feeling upset, I will just ugly cry and it goes nowhere. However, if you send me funny cat memes or bring me chocolate or pictures of unicorns, I'm okay. I can get through my day. So again, like, having those conversations with the people you work with is really important, because everyone's self-care is different and what everyone needs in those hard moments looks really different. People who have an optimistic outlook tend to do better navigating hard situations, and that plays into that resilience piece. And then just having the chance to express your feelings. And again, having those safe, supportive peers at work, having those safe, supportive friends where you are obviously not divulging any confidential information, but you're just able to share your feelings with. And then if that's still not maybe meeting your needs to the point where you're unable to navigate, considering then what those outside supports might look like, and more formally, like telehealth right now, or formal debriefing. So this is just, I thought, a cute little infographic that has some self-care ideas. Self-care is tricky because I think there's this thought, if I spend time on myself, then I'm being selfish. So self-care is not selfish. And if that is the only thing you take away from this presentation today, I am okay with that. One more time, self-care is not selfish. You need that in order to sustain and do this work. Other things that you can do, and these are self-care things, but also just, like, I think, good health things. And when I think of health in this formulation, I'm thinking mental and physical. So journal. Again, I'm one of those people that I need to do writing right after work, right after it happens, to process experiences. I write it all down, close the book, and I'm done with the workday. I might revisit it the next day if I'm really trying to understand something that happened in practice. And it also gives me a really good tool and opportunity to build my own practice skills. Cognitive restructuring is really a sound skill, and that's about choosing what your focus is on. I think of that as when I talk to people a lot, what can I control? And I'm going to choose to focus on what I can control versus what I can't control. I think that's really timely right now, given that there are so many unknowns in our world and even what next school year may look like. So choosing what we focus on and having it be things that we can manage and even maybe develop some mastery toward is going to be really important for sustaining our own mental health and well-being. Healthy habits, not your doctor, and I'm sure you see these everywhere, but they're there for you. We've talked about talking to friends, spending time in nature. And this is great because it can play into social distancing. There's been a ton of research around being outside and how that supports positive mental health. I would encourage you to get outside. Now's a good time. The weather is nice and there's really not much else we get to do for entertainment. Again, you can learn about secondary traumatic stress and self-care. Congratulations, you're already doing it. And then you can proactively plan for coping with stress or develop something called a personal chart. And that, again, is just a form of self-care plan, but figuring out what your needs are and how you're going to respond to your needs before you actually need it. Take breaks. I think, again, this format during distance learning has offered us a lot of opportunities to work at our own pace and space. So if you get an opportunity to sit with your dog for a few minutes, mine is laying on the floor snoring, so if you hear that in the background, go for a quick walk, step outside, compose yourself, turn off the screen for a few minutes, take breaks. Relaxation and self-regulation. Advocate for the types of support you need. Again, if you're feeling like your needs aren't being met, ask for them to be. Where we are really amazing as educators at is we advocate for kids, and then no one advocates for us. So you have to be your own advocate. Avoid nicotine, excessive alcohol, and drugs. Learn to say no. Oh my goodness. Learn to say no. And that even goes back to the boundary around if you have one of those delightful smartphones, turn it off after work. The email has to get shut down, etc. We've talked about professional therapy, stress relieving toys and games. There's been a ton of research around coloring, like those really intense adult coloring sheets actually provide people with a similar brain response to if you were doing meditation. I'm not a big meditator, but man, I love mindful coloring. And then enlist the help of others and also prioritize when possible. It's important that we're there for our teammates. One of the unique things about education is people outside of the education system rarely get it. So having your safe people at school that you can connect with is really important for you to navigate those harder times. Maintaining that social connectedness outside of work as well. And again, like within whatever is comfortable with your boundaries. Some people prefer to keep work at work and social life separate. That's okay. And if you do have those folks at work that you do feel very bonded with and connected to, maintaining that connection is really important and can serve as a protective factor. Developing personal hobbies and interests, accepting good enough. I like to think of, I work at a high school, and I had a scholar a few months ago when we were all in person dancing around teasingly, but yelling, but Miss Cara, D's get degrees, D's get degrees. Now, granted, I would never let that scholar know that that's acceptable because I want to hold them to high standards because that's trauma-informed care. Sometimes though, as adults, we can accept good enough. It's that same mentality. Doing volunteer work can be really beneficial to your health and well-being, just making sure that it's significantly different from what you typically do. So I have tried doing volunteer work where I will do like a warm line and provide mental health services for folks. That was not a break or reinforcing to me, even though I like to help people. I found myself even more exhausted. However, when I volunteer for like prom dress doing drives like Operation Glass Slipper, it's different enough from work because it's pretty dresses. I still get to work with kids. I'm doing something entirely fun and different. So it's really fulfilling, and I feel like it doesn't have those lingering like effects of work when things are hard. If we have any building administrators watching, using tools to assess and address secondary traumatic stress and self-care in your staff is really important. Or if we have any team leads, it's a really good practice. Thinking about developing your own patterns and norms, and then trauma-informed care. Okay, so resilience. I've already alluded to this a little. Resilience is a skill, just like any other skill, and we learn it over time. And the hard thing about resilience is we learn it through adversity. So people are most resilient when they've been through really hard things, which I think doesn't always make a lot of sense, because we would hope that, people wouldn't have to go through hard things to have this like magical skill of resilience. Oftentimes it's framed that way, right? Resilience is that magic pixie dust. Resilience happens when people have to navigate really hard things and they're able to maintain their sense of self. In and of itself, it is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. And relationships are one of the biggest factors. The more supportive, caring relationships a person has, the more resilient they are able to be when they are going through that adverse experience. Hope in our work is vitally important. It is the belief that the future will be better than the present, that you have the power to make it so. So it's about your sense of agency. Because I know my future is going to be better than the present, and I know it's going to be that way because I'm going to work to make it that way. That's what develops in hope. And then realizing that there are many paths to a goal. Oftentimes in education, we have to be really flexible. And when plan A, B, C, and D don't work, we move to plan E. We're really good at this. And just realize no matter what path we go down, it's never free from obstacles. Obstacles are part of life. So when we combine hope and resilience together, that gives us the power to grow and bounce back. And again, vitally important right now during COVID-19. We need the power to grow towards next school year and bounce back for our students. Hope is contagious, just like many emotions. And when we are in person, because there is a giving and receiving of energy in those social experiences, it is more impactful. And still maintaining some connection to students right now, you can pass this feeling of hope onto them. It's just more impactful when we're in person. Oftentimes it's spread through stories, and it is dependent upon our social networks and our families and our friends. It's taught through our actions and providing support to others. So you role model hope for kids every time you have hope in them, and you name it, and you show them what that means. And hope gives us the power to affect change, because the future, if we believe that it's not going to be different, not only is there no hope, but there's no point. Compassion, satisfaction, again, talked about it a little bit. And really the highlight here is just that it's the sense that a person's work is life-giving. Several studies have shown that the same people who reported to having really high levels of secondary traumatic stress have also reported to having the highest level of growth. So these are those people that, they're probably you who's watching this, have had really hard things happen throughout their career and work life day to day. And because of hope and resilience, they're able to grow and move through it and develop some mastery. And that provides us that compassion, satisfaction, that desire to get up and do it all again the next day and be there for kids. Right, so that is all I have for you. I do invite you, if you have any questions, to hit me up. I did see on one of my other presentations, somebody was interested in my resources. I'm always happy to share any of the research I allude to. So again, please shoot me an email. And this is my last presentation, again, during this distance learning paraprofessional development. So I really appreciate all of the time and energy that you've spent with me, and hopefully these were valuable lessons and they brought some humor and light to your day. And I do look forward, hopefully, seeing everyone in person when we resume school in the fall. Thank you, and take care and be well.